He got his first job as an assistant professor at age 25, a full professorship at 32, and was a college president by age 37. He was Deputy Minister of Social Services and then Education for Premier Bob Rae. But Charles Pascal made his biggest mark as the early childhood education czar for former Premier Dalton McGuinty. He is one of the main reasons why we have full-day kindergarten in Ontario. Through the course of 5 decades in the educational trenches, he's learned a thing or two, and he shares some of those lessons in a new book called Leading from the Inside Out: Hard-Earned Lessons from Education, Government, and Baseball. And Charles Pascal joins us now from just outside Picton, Ontario, in Prince Edward County. That's a funky title, Dr. Pascal. Nice to have you on the program. Shall we start with baseball?
Start where you want, and thank you for my living obituary. I thought you were going to end by saying, let us pray, but I appreciate you.
No, not let us pray. Let us talk. Let us talk. I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up this picture here. That's you. You were a baseball catcher at the University of Michigan, and as this picture shows, you look pretty good with your shin pads on and getting ready to call pitches. But I want to ask you a bit of an offbeat question, since baseball's in the title of the book. In terms of job description and mission, what does that job, being a baseball catcher and being a deputy minister in a multi-billion-dollar department of the Ontario government, what do they have in common?
Well, they both occupy positions of formal leadership. A catcher is the only player on the team that faces everybody else, calls the pitches. A deputy minister as well has formal responsibilities. But regarding great leadership, it's all about ensuring that inclusion is part of it. I learned very early through sports that although I had a leadership position, I played quarterback on the high school football team as well. It's about ensuring that you have something larger than yourself through the participation and collaboration of all the people you work with and you learn from. So it's the generic characteristics are pretty much the same regarding of where someone leads, either in formal places or informal places.
Let's go through some of the examples that you reference in the book, and in doing so, we'll talk about some of the biggest issues of the day in the province of Ontario. You tell a story about how you tried to get the whole early childhood education issue on the radar screen of the Premier of the day, and you were having just a very difficult time doing it, even though you had a lot of heavy hitters who were going to bat for you. And then there was this sort of eureka moment where you realized, now I know how we can get the job done. Describe how all that laid itself out for you.
Well, this was at a time where people like the late and great Fraser Mustard, Margaret McCain, the Honorable Margaret McCain, and I had meetings with then the Premier Dalton McGuinty. And, during a meeting with our team, somebody asked the question, don't you know Michael Fullen very well? And the lesson learned here is that if you can have somebody who has a trusting relationship with somebody you're trying to influence, get over yourself and work through a trusting relationship. So I had a breakfast meeting with Michael the next day, and by the time he had his second cup of coffee, we had presented him all of the evidence about the social, economic, and cognitive developmental gains for early learning and care in Ontario. Michael got it immediately, and because Dalton McGuinty had an incredibly trusting relationship with Michael, Michael was the one who brought the case to Premier McGuinty, and days later, I got a personal phone call from Mr. McGuinty asking to meet with us again, even though we had met with him several times. So it's about working through trusting relationships and ensuring that you tap the very best of networks. And with respect to people who don't have large Rolodex, it's absolutely important to understand how it can work through the degrees of separation that we enjoy in Ontario and Canada.
Another lesson you learned along the way, you say, is being right is not a strategy. What does that mean?
Well, we're living in an age right now where, social media in particular bifurcates conversations. It's either this or that. It's Twitter basically foments extremism, and the most important issues of the day requires that we learn more gracefully to live in the gray zone, where we learn to listen more deeply to those who have opposite views. And so, this notion of being right, where we are so convinced that we are right and that everybody else is wrong, is proven to be not very successful, not very helpful. So we need to think about how we reach out to others and how we listen to other points of view. Covey's, one of his successful habits of leadership: seek to understand before seeking to be understood. If we were going to build a bridge from this side of a small river to the other side, we don't start by building on our side. We go to the other side to do a soil analysis. So being right carries with it, unfortunately, oftentimes shutting down listening, and self-righteous behavior, doesn't usually work.
Let me do a follow-up on that, because and now take this compliment, okay? I'm going to give you a compliment, just take it. I bet you there were numerous times when you would go to meetings in the public service, and frankly, you'd be the smartest guy in the room, and everybody would know that you were the smartest guy in the room. How difficult is it to basically come with the approach that I know I'm the smartest guy here and I could probably solve this, and it'd be easier to solve it my way as opposed to have to deal with all these other people, but I can't do it that way?
Well, there have been times where, thank you for your somewhat inaccurate portrayal of who I am, around various tables. Look, there's another lesson learned, which is what is right is more important than who is right, and humility is really a critical factor of great leadership. It's one of the reasons why Jacinda Ardern is, on the top of my my list of world leaders regarding the importance of humility and honesty. And so it's really critical to ensure that there's equitable participation around conversations. Group meetings actually discriminate against introverts who tend to hold back, and they favor people who like to lead out from in front, more likely people like myself. And it requires a huge amount of discipline to basically hold back, and to ensure, if you're involved in any form of leadership in public or private places, or formal or informal, to really understand that what is right is more important than who is right. And in the various roles that you attributed to me earlier, it could be, somebody who has the lowest formal obligations in an organization, whatever the word lowest means, who may come up with the best ideas for how we move forward on something important. I've learned that lesson throughout my career to date.
Here was another lesson you learned, and this is, if you don't mind my saying, a hilarious story, not because it's funny, but because it's terrible, from your career as a deputy minister. And there is a scandal brewing at Queen's Park, and the Secretary of the Cabinet asks everybody around the table for advice. And here's an excerpt from the book. Sheldon, bring this up, and I'm just going to read this. Here's how the story picks up. He continued to press me to reveal my thoughts, to which I reluctantly replied, "Why don't we suggest to the Premier and the ministers that they just tell the truth, explain how things went wrong and how they plan to fix it, and learn from it?" The response from the meeting? The Secretary of Cabinet, the head of Ontario's public service, said, "Why don't we take a 10-minute break?" What did you learn from his response?
Well, I was a rookie deputy minister, and what I learned there is a lesson that keeps repeating itself, even today, even in the last week, and even in the last 24 hours. That basically, what is right is really key, and you can't fudge this stuff. People on the receiving end, whether it's the public at large, voters, or people in your organization, know that there's a time where basically you tell the truth. The public at large is very forgiving. Again, it's humility. It's about lessons learned. And if we just look at current events and current affairs, when we have a prime minister who's done so many things well during the pandemic, who basically on another issue that arises regarding the governor general of our land, and basically says, no, we did all the due diligence, necessary, and everybody on the planet, especially those of us who live in the dominion called Canada, know that there were pre-existing information. So basically, I would have appreciated the prime minister saying something very simple, like, we could have done better, and we will learn a lesson from this. That's all, just a one-liner, because everybody else knows. And when we have a minister of education in Ontario who says that over 75% of all students are in classes of 15 or under, that just people who work in elementary schools across Ontario simply know that's not true. And then notions of accusations of absenteeism, et cetera, it just reduces the credibility of the source of the information. So basically, timely apologies. There's a whole chapter in the book, as you know, Steve, devoted to basically the opportunity of mistake and the opportunity of apology. And it has to be totally contrite. It has to be timely. And apologies that are forced by public opinion that come later basically aren't apologies. Apologies that begin with, if I have offended anybody, I'm sorry. That's not an apology. And the public at large, and those who work in public and private organizations, just thrive and respect leaders who behave like human beings, who make mistakes and who learn from them, as I have throughout my career.
I wanted to bring that story up because in some respects it represents everything people hate about politics. The notion that there are these people in a back room somewhere who are conniving to come up with an alternative story as opposed to doing what you just said. Why do you think the culture of risk aversion persists so much around so much of politics and the public service?
I guess it's the fishbowl. I guess it's this total preoccupation and pressure to behave as though you are doing everything perfectly 6 months prior to the next election or a year prior to the next election. And it's just wrong. It doesn't work. And, we Watergate's a long time ago, but I'm old enough to remember being glued to the television and looking at the fact that it's the cover-up, stupid. And I just don't understand it. But I think it's the crucible in which politicians work. I think it's advisors to politicians who are sometimes more worried about keeping their jobs than ensuring that those they report to keep their jobs in a way that is informed by integrity. So I don't know. There's lots of politicians who are capable of saying, I was wrong, I did this, and I'm learning from this in a timely way. But it's the fishbowl, and it needs to change. And the public at large, as I said, is a forgiving group of folks.
One of the things that you do in the book is that you give a lot of examples, but you don't necessarily name a lot of names. And I want to see if I can break that annoying habit of yours right here by getting you to name names, because when you were a deputy in the Ontario government, you reported, I think, to 9 different cabinet ministers during the course of your career, and that spans across multiple parties, multiple governments. Can I ask you, who was the best cabinet minister to work with?
Well, of that group, there were several. I mean, I reported to Dave Cook, NDP Minister of Education, who was, I think, remarkable. And I should say, Steve, that the calculus for me regarding being a public servant, reporting to a minister of the Crown, that the best calculus is, for me, is that there's 70% substance and 30% politics. If it's all substance and no politics, they won't stay around too long. If it's all politics, I got to tell you, it's hard for somebody like myself, who's pretty clear about what my core values are. So I would name Dave Cook. I reported to Bob Ray as a Deputy Minister of the Premier's Council on Health, Wellbeing, and Social Justice. I reported to Greg Sorbara, a Liberal, was somebody who hired me to Queen's Park for my job as chair of the Ontario Council of Regents for all of the colleges, and actually all but a couple were really great to work with. There was one minister that had a level of insecurity that required that the minister was the one who was always right. And so the minister's staff and I had to figure out how to make sure that the directions we received and the negative comments we got from things that were offered up were put into the minister's words, so that we had to work hard to make sure the minister felt that the minister was right and the rest of us were wrong. So, but they were all.
No, hang on, hang on. You can't drop that story and not name names. Who was that?
Not going to do that.
You're no fun.
Not going to do that. I know, but look, it is what it is. I broke a few other eggs where I did name the foibles of ministers who were a little bit too far from perfect. And of course, my last minister was John Snoblin from Mr. Harris's government. And he and I actually worked well together until people in Mr. Harris's office said that I was using the word equity in a sentence too often. And I was the last of the previous administration's deputies to be asked to do something else in life. But I learned something from each and every one of them. And, I'm not out to make anybody feel comfortable, so many years later.
You are, if I can say it, a rather different kind of former deputy minister, in as much as basically every deputy I've ever known in the past, I think this is true, once they're no longer a deputy, they kind of like to fade away. I mean, maybe there's an exception along the way, but basically, they don't like to make a lot of waves. Dr. Pascal, that is not you. You are on Twitter all the time, weighing in on the big issues of the day, and beyond that, taking real tough shots, as you have here today, on television against the current Minister of Education, for example. And here you are in your book, for example. Let's do this quote here. Ontario's current premier has taken things to such an extreme regarding the offering of disinformation nonsense that an increasing number of constituents don't believe a thing he says. Why are you not like most deputy ministers who like to just sort of fade away into the background and not make waves?
Well, before I was a deputy minister, I was a person of evidence. I was a professor with a very strong interest in evidence-based policy making. So it's, so many career deputies are chosen for and trained during to have no official public comment about anything. When I was a deputy minister, it was extremely rare for me to be quoted anywhere because that's the way it should be. I didn't have the courage to run for elected office, as so many do, and I admire that. And so before I was a deputy, I was a person of evidence-based policymaking, communicating the best evidence about what policy options might make a difference to a better future for the many rather than the few. And so post deputy minister, I'm back as an academic who's evidence-oriented and a passion for ensuring that the future is healthier, safer, more just, and prosperous for the many rather than the few. That's my mantra. And so it's natural that I would continue calling out evidence or evidence-informed political masters and others who do things that are, I think, contrary to my particular evidence-informed version of the future. And so I'm an equal opportunity critic. And during this conversation, I've called attention to the foibles of somebody at a different level of government with a different political stripe. I'm a nonpartisan, and I'm evidence-oriented, so let it rip.
Well, we're going to do that now. I'm going to take you back to 2007, and we're going to let her rip because, well, here's the scene. John Tory is the leader of the Ontario PC Party, and you get a call from a guy who I don't know if there's another politician on earth that you have more respect for than the 18th Premier of Ontario, Bill Davis. And Mr. Davis, who's helping Mr. Tory, says he wants to get you on board for the idea of promoting Mr. Tory's plan to offer public funding to faith-based schools. Here's your hero, Bill Davis, calling. What did you tell him?
Well, probably one of the few times in my life, certainly my adult life, that I was at a loss for words. There was a pause. And I basically said, Premier, two wrongs don't make a right. And this is the wrong thing to do. I understand the context in which you extended public funding to separate schools. That was then. This is now. And if John does this, he will lose. And I will not be among those who will be silent. Later I don't know whether it's in the book or not. I can't recall. Later that same day, I got a call from our now mayor, John Tory, who basically, we had about an hour and 10-minute phone call in which he convinced me that his approach to this was equity. If extension to the Catholic communities was important, we should extend it to all religions. And I believe that he was informed by a very deep commitment to equity. It was just the wrong policy, and that was it. And Mr. McGuinty won the election, and Toronto was blessed with having a superb mayor. But it was the only time Premier Davis and I had one other disagreement throughout our trusting relationship. I think it's reciprocal, and that's our version of whether it's time for Her Majesty to take leave of Canadian society.
Well, we'll leave that one aside for a second, because I do want to ask a follow-up, because you're, according to the book anyway, you went even further than it. You said to Mr. Davis, apparently, not only is this the wrong plan, but I will do everything in my power to oppose it. You said that to Bill Davis. How did he take that?
Well, he's a remarkably generous human being. And he, as you know, Steve, through your, biographical brilliance regarding, Mr. Davis's journey, he's loyal. He's loyal to friends and to colleagues. I don't think he's loyal to a fault. I think he was surprised, but it never diminished our relationship. In fact, I did follow up on what I said I would do. I gathered 50 names on an op-ed that we wrote and published them in all the newspapers about why it was wrong, and the names affixed to that op-ed were pretty prominent, and it was eventually used as a householder, one of those leaflets that people in the opposition parties actually took on the hustings. So, yeah, I did work on it, and again, it was not political. It was evidence-based regarding what is good public policy, and I do not believe that public dollars ought to be used for supporting the religious aspirations of any one group within our society. I've advocated for ensuring that our education curricula are infused with a comparative religion and views about different value systems, including agnosticism and atheism, so that there's an increased respect for inclusion and understanding of how different religions go at various issues, to bring people together rather than create separate notions that are driven by individuals' religion.
Let me do one more follow-up, since you mentioned the word respect there. Since you so publicly broke with them on an issue which turned out to be absolutely fundamental in the resolution of that 2007 election, do you think in the long run it harmed your relationship with either former Premier Davis or the current Mayor John Tory?
You'd have to ask them, but they're both very generous individuals with whom I maintain a ongoing and regular contact, and that includes John, our mayor in Toronto, and certainly the 18th Premier of Ontario. So you'd have to ask them. But unless they are playing me, I think the respect has maintained itself. Again, what is right's more important than who is right, and I think they both understand that and have behaved accordingly.
All right, in our last 30 seconds here, Charles, the word baseball is in the title of your book, so we must end there. American League East for the upcoming season, what's the standings going to be?
The team who wins the most, who gains the most wins against losses is going to take it without question. Regarding your Boston Red Sox, it could be another long year for you, Steve. I'm a fan of the game, so I want all Blue Jays fans, for example, to watch games that don't involve the Blue Jays so that we can all learn more about the game without being homers that don't open our eyes to what we can learn from this remarkable game. The acquisition of George Springer for Blue Jays fans is a very good omen. But I have no predictions for this. I do not like what baseball has done during the pandemic with these ridiculous little league rules that are in service of destroying the best game on earth.
There's one thing we never have to worry about when we talk to you, and that is where you stand. In any event, Charles Pascal, it's been really good having you on the program. The name of the book is Leading from the Inside Out. And you stay safe in the county during these COVID times, okay?
Back at you, Steve. Thank you so much for this.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.